Welcome to Season 2 of the Inspectations Podcast, hosted by Justin Starbird, CEO of the Abley Group. In business, as in life, one of the most difficult tasks a leader must do is find a way to manage expectations. Create expectations that are too high, and you will be constantly looked at as a failure. Create expectations that are too low, and your leadership will be questioned at every turn. Being able to inspect what you expect helps keep great teams pulling in the same direction and allows for pivots in real time. The Inspectations Podcast brings together business leaders from all industries to talk about best practices, innovation, leadership, and business development. You're listening to the Inspectations Podcast. Here's your host, Justin Starbird.
Welcome back to the Inspectations Podcast. My name is Justin Starbird. We get to kick off Season 2 today with a first-time guest, longtime friend, Vice President of Sales and Marketing for Precision Optics Corporation, Robert Austring. Robert, thanks for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me, Justin. I appreciate the opportunity and love to share what we're doing here at POC in the industry as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, you and I go way back on these podcasts. It was one of the first shows I ever did was actually with you.
Wow, one of the first ones. Well, I know we did a whole series back it's been several years ago. You know, that were always beneficial in a number of ways beyond just getting out there and extending to a larger audience, but it also created introspect on ourselves and what we're doing and how we best want to communicate it. So it was a really valuable exercise.
Yeah, and I'm excited to have it kind of come full circle where you're joining my show today, and we're kicking off Season 2, where instead of just focusing on business services and some of the things that the Abley Group does, we're actually looking more in terms of what's going on in the medical device, medical technology, medical manufacturing space. And POC, Precision Optics Corp, you guys do a lot of neat things. You want to talk a little bit about who POC is and what you do?
Sure. Back when we started this together years ago, I was CEO at Lighthouse Imaging. And Lighthouse and Precision Optics were what we called friendly competitors, both specializing in the world of endoscopy since the early 80s. So there's been a long and storied tradition between the two. As I said, friendly competition. And about a little over a year ago, Precision Optics acquired Lighthouse primarily to take on the expertise that Lighthouse had developed over the last decade plus around the CMOS technology. Traditional endoscopy involved rigid lenses and fiber stuffed in tubes. And with the advent of CMOS sensors in the electronics, it allowed us to expand the applications associated with endoscopy, and Lighthouse really took that on, and then POC decided to add that through an acquisition. They were developing it themselves, but they were a little further behind than we were at Lighthouse, so they brought it on board. But so now with POC, we house both the development and manufacturing of complete medical devices in the visualization spectrum, as well as custom micro optics and micro prisms. As in addition to that, we also have a third entity within the enterprise that sources optics worldwide and basically does secondary processing for those optics. And so when people have specific needs for optics, we can custom make them or we can source them. We can do custom subassemblies for optical subassemblies, as well again as complete medical systems.
And you mentioned that you were a CEO of LHI previously, and through the merger, became the Vice President of Sales and Marketing. What does your role look like today versus where you were before, and what are you working on now?
Interestingly, I specialize in this world of endoscopy, and so I continue to monitor strategic trends, gather market intelligence, what things are going where, what the technology that we developed with CMOS has really opened up a lot of new clinical applications because we can get into spaces much smaller with much higher resolution. And so, it's a very evolving technology now, and clinically, there's just so many new opportunities that this is allowing for. And so I continue to monitor that. I'm also working to lead the efforts for their marketing, overall marketing programs, as well as the digital marketing side of the business. And that's primarily what I spend, a good 80-90% of my time on. I still do work with new prospects and bring prospects in and maintain relationships with existing clients as an AM or account manager. So that's primarily my day.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure, no shortage of downtime for sure, right?
Yeah. No, but it's
good.
a lot of fun. At the pressures of running a company as CEO, they grind on you after a while. And,
Sure.
I'm certainly, I'll tell you, my wife thinks I'm much more pleasant to be around these days.
Yeah.
when you're managing a lot of stress, it does take its toll on you over time.
No doubt. Well, you and I are both getting, usually I don't timestamp our interviews very often, but some time sensitive information is coming our way here, where you and I are both speaking at the Informa event, MD&M East, at the Javits Center in New York City. It's actually next week. And we've done that before for different topics, but you have a real interesting topic coming up where you're talking about some of the challenges and benefits around the use of endoscopic devices, both on single use and multi-use, and the differences. Tell me a little bit of what you are envisioning that talk to go like.
Well, one of the challenges that we face, and the talk really talks about single-use devices and multi-use devices with an emphasis on endoscopy. But as we've come through, one of the challenges with endoscopy is, and it's based on the procedure. So certain procedures are more sensitive to contamination or infections than others. And so one of the challenges in the world of endoscopy is making sure that you're getting this endoscopes reprocessed effectively so that they're clean and sanitary, because they go from patient to patient. And there are some challenges. Some of these are very complex instruments with a lot of, for lack of a better word, nooks and crannies that are difficult to clean and get cleaned. And so, there's always the potential for cross-contamination between patients. And that can be a big problem. And then, we entered the COVID situation, which really brought into play, managing and ensuring that we weren't cross-contaminating and bringing germs from one patient to the other. And so this whole discussion around single-use instrumentation really gained a lot of steam over the last 4 years or so.
Sure.
And the question is, as our prospects, as our clients look to, do we make this a single-use instrument or do we make this a multi-use instrument? There are a lot of factors that are involved in that, and it can be quite challenging to do that. And so what I'm going to be doing is just providing, a very short overview of some of the things to consider and some of the approaches that you can take to help in the decision-making process as you move forward and develop your product for the market.
Everything you just shared about, some of the things that go on when you're talking about reusing a device through endoscopic procedures, sounds scary to somebody that could be listening today. I know part of your talk is going to be breaking down the differences between a reusable device and a single-use device, and each of them have their challenges. Where do you see, disposables fitting into the equation, especially now that COVID's complete?
Well, there are pros and cons to each device, and as clients consider which approach they want to take, there are factors that really influence that decision. And so, as part of my talk, I'm going to be identifying those factors. Not every procedure, not every endoscope really is viable for a single-use type of procedure. And so you need to understand and take into account these various factors. I mean, you have to consider the economics. Medical devices there's reimbursements that are incurred per clinical procedure. And that essentially sets a ceiling. And so the client has to understand what that reimbursable is. And then they have to make sure that their device or their contribution to that procedure falls within that ceiling. And of course, they've got to ensure that there's margin within that as well. It can't all be cost.
Yeah.
And so they have to consider the economics of a single-use device or a reusable device. And one of the things that we talk about with clients is a cost per case basis as a consideration. And so, they have to take into account the economics. They have to take into account annual volumes. They have to take into account their distribution model, sales representation, because there's an investment in each type of device, whether it's single-use or disposable.
And, of course, they also have their, benefits. Once you make a determination relative to which device you're going to use based on the procedure that it's going to be used for, there are some significant benefits to using them as well, correct?
Yeah, there are pros and cons to both. If we think about the single-use or disposable, one of the pros is obviously patient safety because the exposure to cross-contamination. And so, that's obviously at the top of the list. Patient safety is always at the top of the list. From a company's perspective, or even an end user perspective, to reduce reprocessing costs, when you think about a hospital and the scope and the process of cleaning, reprocessing, decontaminating, sterilizing scopes, it involves quite a suite of equipment and people that have to do this on a daily basis. It also increases the inventory that you need to carry, because if you've got a scope that's going through the reprocessing procedure and you've got a procedure scheduled, you need the instrument. And so now you have to duplicate the number of instruments that you carry. So reducing, the inventory costs for the hospital, reducing the reprocessing costs for the hospital, those are all cost savings that benefit the end user. For the company, from that perspective, warranty, you have no warranties on a single use per se. Repair costs, inventory, logistics, none of those things become a factor for you now, because when you carry reusables, they're under warranty or they break and they have to be repaired. And now you've got to get those back and you got to manage the logistics and you've got to then verify that it's still performing. And, there's a whole host of things that happen in this reprocessing or repair loop. The other benefit to the company is it becomes a consumable. So now you've got, repeat sales. It's the old razor and razor blade. And so, you've got a built-in repeat sales revenue. And then, of course, one of the things that COVID showed us and that we've been talking about for a number of years is to be able to deploy these in an emergency medical situation, EMTs, carry them on the emergency vehicle. They can carry around these sterile devices, open them up, use them, throw them away, and you're done. You don't have to worry about getting them back. You don't have to worry about, again, cross-contamination, et cetera. So there are a lot of pros to single use. And there are cons as well, which, I'll tell you, one of the cons, frankly, is the lower margins associated with what you can sell a single-use device for, as opposed to the reuse device. And there's a higher investments in inventory. You've got to carry a lot more inventories. You got to carry a lot more material, raw materials to make these, because you're not making 1,000 a year, you're making hundreds of thousands a year. And so you've got to be prepared for that investment. And that investment also drives into technology and into manufacturing. And you have to be considered, how much you got to drive labor cost. I mean, everywhere you can, you have to drive cost out. So you've got to be considerate of how we're going to be producing these devices and thinking about automation and the investment in automation. Your supply chain and vertical integration. If you're outsourcing the manufacturing of these, say molding, injection molding, or machining, or any of that, you really need to think about bringing that stuff in-house, because if you're outsourcing it, you're paying someone to produce it, you're paying their labor, but you're also paying their margin. So now you're adding margin into the equation. So vertical integration becomes a real considerate strategy that you have to take into account.
And I've got a couple of follow-ups to both of those elements that you brought up, because the medical space was hit really hard by the crunch in supply chain. Relative to what COVID taught us, not just from a preparedness perspective, but from a critical supply chain standpoint, what did that do to a lot of the single-use devices as it became more difficult to actually acquire materials to make them? Did you and the team see see difficulties, and maybe from the larger medical device manufacturing standpoint, what did COVID really do to that supply chain?
It impacted most the electronic side of the business.
Yeah.
And so what that forced us to do is, we had to develop additional suppliers, but we also had to invest in carrying higher levels of inventory and making larger purchases and getting creative around how we manage that supply chain and the acquisition. So those were the big challenges that we faced at POC Lighthouse. Were really on the electronic side of the business.
Did you see that in other areas as well, relative to labor? Now all of a sudden you were looking at, employing new folks that have higher technical skill sets. Was it more difficult to find, or has it continued to stay competitive post-COVID?
I think in the medical space we were somewhat insulated. Insulated more than most. The hospitality industry really took a hit on labor, but in our case, because we do work in clean rooms and we are very sanitary, we had a lot of procedures in place to ensure the safety of all employees. So people were screened as they came to work, and we implemented procedures both at work and recommendations at home. And so we were able to maintain our base, and frankly, we didn't see a reduction in orders and in volume. We actually saw an increase. So we were going out and hiring more of the people that were not being able to go to work in a normal situation. So for us, labor was positively impacted, as was the overall business in the COVID situation over the last several years.
Sure. Well, in addition to the work that you do with disposables and how you guide your clients to making the best decision, both for their financial success as well as the long-term partnership, reusables also have their place. Can you talk a little bit about how the decision comes to manufacture, create a reusable device versus a disposable?
Absolutely. And again, economics are typically at the highest consideration here. If you have lower volumes, it becomes hard to leverage economies of scale that you would with a disposable. And so lower volumes typically are more difficult to turn into single use. You have to consider the clinical procedure as well. and I'm not going to get into some of that, but there are various procedures that really aren't exposed to cross-contamination. And even if they are, they're insignificant because it's a non-sterile environment. And so it's not as critical. But some of the pros associated with reusable is, from a hospital's perspective, we talked about the reprocessing costs. The hospitals have to do that cost-benefit analysis relative to, is it better for me to do that reprocessing because my cost per case basis on a reusable instrument is less, or is it more of cost-effective to not have to do that and do a disposable? And so, the client needs to be considering what the market is doing, what's out there today, what products are there, what is the market doing? Because if you're going to differentiate from the market, you've got to be able to justify why that is. And adoption is typically the most difficult thing to do in medical devices. People are used to doing things a certain way. So if you shift that paradigm, you've got to be prepared to provide that education and invest the effort that it takes to do that. So looking at what's going on in the market today in that particular product segment, it has to be a consideration you make. The volumes have to be a consideration that you make. One of the real pros is there are higher margins. I don't know if I touched on that with the disposables, but there are much lower margins that you try and make up with volume. In the case of reusables or CapEx equipment, you get much higher margins than you would. Your cost per case basis is much lower. You have lower manufacturing investments because you don't have to necessarily drive automation to do 1,000 or even 10,000 a year.
Right.
And so they're much more suitable for lower volumes. The thing we didn't touch on that is sensitive in a lot of areas. In fact, the EU really isn't a fan of disposable instrumentation, is the environmental friendliness of a particular product. With disposables, there's a lot of waste. With reusables, there's no waste. Well, there is, but it's 5 years down the road at the end of the life cycle. So, environmental considerations have to play into part of that. And again, that comes back to assessing the market and understanding what the market opportunity is.
You're in a pretty unique spot where POC offers both the whole soup to nuts, experience for your clients, where you go from design and inception all the way to manufacturing and commercialization. Is that the true POC advantage, or is there something more?
Well, it is what we like to say. First and foremost, we are a partner and a collaborator with our clients. And so because of our business model, we are not just a development firm. We are a manufacturing firm first and foremost. And as such, we want to make sure that we've designed and developed the best product possible such that there's a long manufacturing opportunity. And by best product, I'm talking about efficacy of the device. The device has to function in the clinic. And so you want it to be optimal. And in our case, an endoscopy, it's, you give the best quality image time after time after time. And so, we want to be that partner with our clients as we move through this process. So not only do you have functionality, but you've got the economic side of this, which is making sure that, not anyone, but, engineering firms, all engineering firms can design a great product. And in many cases, they're over-designed. And as a result, the products are too expensive. And, you've got this, again, back to this ceiling of medical reimbursement. If you've designed a product that exceeds the medical reimbursement, you don't have a product. And so what we do at POC is we take into account that market. We work with our clients early on in the first stage of development, which is our planning phase. And we define what the requirements are for that functional device. We also define what is that targeted transfer price? What is the price the client desires to pay for a finished device? And that is an important number to understand. And many times our clients have to go back and do the work to understand that number, because they need to make sure that they get margin on top of that and that it fits their business model. What we're trying to do is help them navigate this process and look at feature sets and look at complexity and look at manufacturing methodologies and take all the factors that influence not only functionality, but cost in the equation. And the ideal scenario is when we exit the product development process and we're getting ready to transfer to manufacturing, we have an optimal product performance at the right targeted price. And that's a win-win for our client. That's a win-win for the end user. And it's obviously a win-win for POC.
Well, yeah, absolutely. It because you're able to see the whole picture, you're able to, not just understand what's happening today, but also be able to help the client plan for what's coming, right? And I think that's a big opportunity for you to set yourselves apart, because not everybody has the chance to do that.
Yeah. I've worked for some of the largest medical device firms in the world, and none of them can come back on me for this, but the reality is this: working in research and development for over 20 years, we would devise some outstanding products, and then we would, but not considering cost in the equation, and then we literally throw them over the wall to manufacturing and tell them to go produce them. And many times things would come back because they were too complex. There were too many features. They just, they couldn't be produced profitably. And at the end of the day, we're in the business for profit. Everyone's in that business for profit, obviously, as well as efficacy for the patient. But you've got to be considerate of all of the contributing factors, and that's what we help our clients understand. What are those factors? And we navigate that all the way through the phases of development. It's continually reevaluated and considered as we move through this process. What are the optimal manufacturing? How do we drive labor? How do we drive material costs? All of those things have to be considered in order to get to that optimal solution, which is product performance at the right cost.
Yep. Not that you can see into a crystal ball, but if you're able to, look ahead, what are some challenges that you see, in the coming year that could have an impact here on the space?
Well, the challenges from an industry perspective, Justin, or from a POC perspective?
We'll start with industry and then maybe from a POC.
Well, the challenge in the industry, medical device is somewhat insulated. And so, the challenges that we see really are in positive ways. Again, continuing to see how this technology can be applied. What new spaces can we now provide visualization to? We're going inside the heart. We're going inside the brain. We're going inside the spine. We're providing imaging now where, direct visual imaging, not just, MRIs or x-rays, but direct visualization to these surgeons so that they can go in and be able to see what they're dealing with. And in many cases, you're going to see more evolution towards different utilization of light in order to identify potential disease states within, a particular organ or whatever they happen to be observing at that time. Mm-hmm. And so, the challenge is going to be continuing to support the evolution of this visualization for docs, which is going to continue to improve treatment and hopefully, with minimally invasive surgical procedures, obviously recovery time has gone down dramatically. Infections have gone down dramatically, and our ability to provide visualization in much smaller orifice size has really allowed a lot of this to happen. And now to expand that to different light modes and other things that we're doing with visualization really is going to continue to allow this thing to evolve. And for us, the challenge is, continuing to advance that technology and advance, the application of that technology, which really is part of the POC challenge. We have to continue to advance that technology and look for ways to meet the requirements that are coming at us from our clients that, hey, we want to do this in this space.
Next week, you and I are going to be, as I mentioned at the start, in New York City at MD&M East at the Javits Center in New York City. And, you're going to be talking a lot about these elements. What else can, not to give away too much of your talk, but is there anything else that people are going to learn by attending your session?
I hope that they get a global view and, a holistic view of what it takes and what the requirements are. That's fundamentally what I'm trying to do here, is educate individuals that are interested in developing these devices so that they understand the factors that need to be considered. We work with a host of different prospects from an education level. Some people come to us with simply a sketch on a napkin, and others come to us with 50-page requests for quote. But it's important that these guys have the perspective on what it's going to take, because now it begins to make sense as we walk them through the process of development, as we talk about product requirements, as we talk about feature sets, because a lot of times they're so focused on the clinical application side, they're not always thinking about the product side as we talk about the economic side. So, what people are going to be able to see is a holistic picture of the things that you need to be considering as you're looking at moving forward with developing a new product, in most specifically in an endoscope.
Well, that's great, Robert. I'm thankful to have had the opportunity to have you on as a guest today. Thanks for giving me a preview of what's to come and get back in the saddle a bit here.
Well, I sure appreciate the opportunity. As you know, I'm passionate about this stuff. I just love to chat about it. I'll chat about it all day. It's a great industry we're in. There's not a better medical devices. There's not a better industry out there. You go home every day feeling great about your contribution to society. And so, again, thank you for giving me the vehicle to speak to this. And then, I look forward to seeing you next week.
Yeah, likewise. It's been great to have you on, Robert. I can't wait to see you next week.
Very good.
You've been listening to the latest episode of the Inspectations Podcast, powered by the Abley Group. On behalf of my guest today, Robert Austring, the Vice President of Sales and Marketing for Precision Optics Corp., I'm Justin Starbird. Until next time.
You have been listening to the Inspectations Podcast. On behalf of your host, Justin Starbird, and our guests today, thank you for listening. To learn more about the Inspectations Podcast, our guest, or the Abley Group, please visit us at www.ableygroup.com. Be sure to keep inspecting what you are expecting.